Good morning. Good morning. I'm Peter Caracappa. I'm not George Hsu. Unfortunately, he had a conflict, couldn't make it here today. But he asked me to kind of fill in for him, and I've been working with him and his research group for somehow it's managed to be more than 10 years now. So hopefully I can provide you a reasonable facsimile of George for today's presentation, which I'm going to focus on. Mike did a great overview on this topic, which obviously we all have a lot of interest in. What I'm going to try and focus on specifically is a little bit of history and a little bit of kind of where we are and where we're going in terms of the patient model itself, right? And so just and he already kind of gave you an introduction on this, a little bit of context, a little bit of why we're here and why we're trying to determine this information is to focus on the risks from radiation exposure that we are subjecting patients to in order to get medically relevant information in the kind of greater scheme of understanding these behaviors. The world organizations, national organizations are interested in the kind of dose that individuals are receiving. The Bayer Committee, having made their statement looking at tracking and understanding dose on the level of dose to individual organs to understand the kind of risk that's associated with it, and also mentioned that the International Commission on Radiological Protection, in kind of a parallel but similar way, looks at how those organ doses fit together and what kind of risk comes from those. So we're interested in understanding the risk to a particular organ, which of course is going to vary very strongly with the scanner type, the energy of the scan, the current that's applied, all of the different factors that are associated with an individual CT examination. And then we also know that not every organ in the body is receiving anything close to the same kind of dose, although some of the results that were shown that in certain scan ranges they're not too far away, but over the entire length of the body, the in-field and out-of-field doses are going to vary very strongly, and not every organ has the same sensitivity to radiation exposure. And so we kind of put together those into a marker of risk, which is known as effective dose. And this is kind of evolved over time, but it's that weighted average of dose to individual organs. And just kind of for example, we see that this is something that has changed over time. The original definition, which was originally called effective dose equivalent, defined in 1977, which of course is what the U.S. still uses for its measures of dose for occupational doses, that had just a handful of organs defined. Wrong direction here. Lung and breast tissue was defined, the thyroid, but only a small handful of organs. This revised again in 1990 under ICRP 60 and renamed effective dose. Right, and then this was just revised a couple of years ago with a new set of dose weighting factors, organ weighting factors that were associated in ICRP 103. And as you can see, the list never gets shorter. The list only gets longer, but it gets more specific. So added specificity to certain organs, like the addition of salivary glands as an individual organ, and the addition of the brain, which may be kind of important for a lot of head CT work that's done. Now, I will point out, of course, that some of these that are added, brain, salivary glands, are not entirely new. Salivary glands was entirely new. Brain, at the time, was included in what is listed here as the remainder, which is not just everything else, but is actually a specific list of additional organs that all get lumped together, and their dose that's included. So we do actually have another, in ICRP 103, it's 13 additional organs that are included. They include things like the prostate, and the lymph nodes, and I can't list all 13, and you probably don't care, but there's a list of a number of specific additional tissues that all gets combined in a linear average into the remainder dose. Okay? So now if we want to determine radiation dose, this is not news to anybody, but there's basically two classes of processes that we can follow. We can either take a physical machine, walk into our clinic or hospital or wherever we have it, put something in the machine to represent a patient, whether it be a very simple cylindrical phantom like is done on a regular basis, or you can get to what is a more realistic representation of an individual, perform a scan, and have some kind of measurement tool, whether it be thermoluminescent dosimeters or MOSFETs that you can include into the phantom, and read the measurement. And that's great. That's as good as you get. You know exactly what the dose is because you've measured it. But that is not a very robust process in that it applies only to that very specific scan that you just performed on that very specifically shaped phantom. And it takes a lot of time, and it takes time away from use of the machine, and nobody wants to be doing a lot of that. I think everybody would hopefully agree. The other strategy, of course, is to do experimentation in a computational way, right? Using Monte Carlo methods, or you could use other radiation transport methods, but instead take that scanner, model it virtually, and track computationally the behavior of radiation that's emitted and what happens to it as it interacts with a person, right? It's a virtual experiment. It's a computational experiment, and we can do that many different times under many situations. Of course, that relies on having good descriptions, having realistic descriptions of all of that information. So we already have talked a little bit about that, but we're going to look at then those descriptions of individuals and a little bit of history of how they've evolved over time, over roughly 50 years of time. If you go back probably the early part of those 50 years, the phantoms that were used, the measurements, the computations were no more complex than a cylinder or a slab of water, which is nice, and the physics of it all behaves very nicely, but doesn't tell us a whole lot. Going back to kind of the late 1970s, early 1980s, the first generation of representation of the human body kind of came about. And it looked like this. I've never seen a person that looks exactly like that, but it looks like a person, right? We can identify a number of different individual organs, and they all are basically in the place that we would expect them to be on an individual, right? They don't really look like that, but they have all the pieces. And then into the 1990s, particularly late 1990s, the next generation really became popular, which is what we'll kind of call the voxel phantoms. They're image-based phantoms. Until finally, then the third generation that came out of that, looking at the limitations of those rigid image-based phantoms, or being able to make deformable or modifiable phantoms, computational models. And we often will call these the BREP phantoms, or the BREP, or boundary representations of individual organs. And thinking that the path that we've been marching on in all of this evolution through the last number of decades is to be more and more be able to be more and more specific to a given individual. Okay, so if we just kind of think about, this is just an interesting chart of how many phantoms have been published. People just kind of create phantoms and put them out there, put information available. And we saw there was a bunch, a couple of people were working on a couple different areas in the 1970s, then nothing happened, and then we had a couple more modifications that came out, and then boom, in the last number of years, and we can track this very easily with how computational resources have evolved and all of those sorts of things. So it shouldn't be too much of a surprise, but we have a panoply of different kinds of phantoms that are available to us today, right? And just to put that together, George and Keith Eckerman a couple of years ago put together a monograph that looked at a little bit of this history of the development and different kinds of models of the human body available for radiation dosimetry, and he likes to it's his book. He's very proud of it, so we'll kind of include it there. But maybe a more interesting picture that comes from it is that, as you can kind of see, that there's a wide variety of available representations of an individual, and they all look like people, and they're all a little bit different. Just to kind of give you an example, this is just a small slice of the variety of phantoms that have become available. So if we look just to look in a little bit more detail at this evolution, we know that first generation of phantoms was given by mathematical descriptions of surfaces, right? Kind of up to fourth order equations in some cases, but basically ellipses, cones, cylinders, spheres, all of them were these kinds of definitions, and the Boolean combinations. We could take a liver we can see is really a cylinder that is bounded on one side by a plane, for whatever. It's all very simple mathematics defining what were surfaces. These first generation of phantoms were surface definition phantoms, but they were fixed to mathematical quadratic equations, basically. And you looked at that for the entire body, and then some of those that were available got more specific. They kind of took a look, and this looks like it looks like something I saw in one of the Terminator movies, but it basically is all of the a lot of the more specific structures of the head and neck to be able to get better dosimetry for the head. Still doesn't look like a real person in a lot of ways, but it has a lot of the features that people were interested in this time period. This was in the mid-1990s. So the second generation that kind of came along was what we started to call image-based phantoms, or they kind of got the name voxel phantom, right? And what that comes from is that, of course, this was now, instead of defining defining a convex shape by the boundaries of certain mathematical equations, the process was basically to take a array of what were simple shapes, cubes or rectangular prisms, from a set of image data and identify each individual element, right? Each individual voxel was identified as being part of a particular organ, whether it was done by, it had to have been done somehow, manually identified, some kind of more automatic methods, right? And you can kind of see there's a lot of them, a number of these kinds of phantoms came about from CT data. Some of them came from MR data. And then we also had it at RPI developed this particular phantom, which was developed from the visible human data, color photographs. But they all fundamentally had some of the same issues. Color photographs provided us some nice benefit, as that we could identify items by color. But you can see that you were still down at the pixel level, at the voxel level. You had all of the features that come with images, right? And so we had to try and figure, all right, if we look at this section, what is, and I don't know exactly what I'm looking at here, what is muscle and what is bone, or whatever boundaries that we were looking for, right? But we could put that together and define, based on both the anatomical references and how much of each we expect to see, we'd put together a segmented image where now we have this vast array, each element of which belongs to one individual organ or tissue, right? And we can make nice, pretty pictures like this. That looks like a person. That looks very much like the person that it represented, who was a executed murderer. But that's where the data came from. But it looks like him, right? It represented him in a very exact way, which is great, and it was much more realistic than the images that we were looking at before of these stylized models, but still represented only a single individual. And this class of models had some issues that were associated with it, which is, of course, that the limits in resolution If you look at the series of images, if you looked at a phantom that was being developed from CT images, you have the lack of contrast between similar density tissues, being able to identify those. And one that's particularly, a little bit problematic is also the identification of red bone marrow or marrow at all, particularly in small-sized bones. You look at the spinal cord and you zoom in on the. This is from the CT numbers. Those aren't CT numbers; those are a modified number. But you can see that you're trying to figure out what the what the boundary for the bone is versus the marrow segment, and how those all. So that's a lot of kind of complex work and some subjective decision making that has to be done in order to create those phantoms. But it's work that requires individual intervention in that process. So the third generation, if we kind of follow this through, is now instead of looking just at a regular array, we kind of have gone back to the surface definition, boundary representation of the individual organs and the individual tissues. The outer, these are basically looking at the outer surface here, and in terms of fetal dose measurements, this was kind of our earliest attempt at this process, which was limited. We kind of focused on the embryo or the fetus in this development, but being able to take a unstructured surface, whether it be some groups looked at complex mathematical definitions like NURBS, surface definitions, or what we kind of ended up focusing on was a mesh surface, which is an unstructured mesh. The purpose basically being the same in that you have a definition of this boundary that you can manipulate in a much more robust way. Anybody that has taken their kids to see Toy Story 2 or any of our other Pixar or anything that has come along knows that there's a lot of, outside of radiation protection, there's a lot of work on how that's done. You basically borrowed some of the tools from that kind of computer graphics world, and you have the ability to manipulate these surfaces in a lot more, like I said, a lot more robust way. So you can have a basic definition of, for instance, of a fetus and modify it to, different shapes and deform the organs that are surrounding it in a way that is more realistic. So, kind of an early attempt at this that ultimately led to a full definition of basic individuals, what we called our adult male and adult female phantoms, which are full body boundary representation models, right? So all of the organs that are included, we have 70 some different individually identified organs, 45 different bone components, muscle structures, all those things, and these were developed then. So we started with, organ information and modified them so that they matched that ICRP definition, that definition under ICRP 89 of the reference person, what ICRP says a person looks like. So we were able to make that, and then we can then use that for dose comparison, which is good because now we have a robust model, looks realistic, and we can do interesting things with it. If we put it up against all of those image-based models, each image-based model, there were some that looked good, they were close to ICRP, but each one was a little bit different, a little bit didn't quite match up. VIP man, or that previous generation, was too heavy. Right? He was a lot more massive than the reference man. And every model you kind of go to, you see the same thing. Now we have all of this matches. And ICRP kind of did a similar process to develop their standard image models that they published a couple of years ago, ICRP 110. 111, I forget the number that came out. The same basic idea where it was a representation that represented the standard person. However, when we get to this, when we have this kind of representation of a person, we have one major advantage over the voxel images. And if you want to change the shape, change the position of an organ with the image-based models, you can't really do that. Everything is fit into this very rigid, cubic, rectangular lattice. And that with these surface definitions, we can turn around and modify the positions of the surfaces to make bigger or smaller sizes, now representing differently sized individuals. So kind of the first, first pass that would be to modify the size of a person to vary based on weight. Right? And so we can look at the range from what started at, maybe not a perfect percentile, but what started at as our reference person, and look at then, well, what's an individual that is lighter and an individual that is heavier? How does that shape change? And there's a couple of pieces that kind of go into that. We need to consider, where the fat goes, and a big chunk of it, we know goes into the subcutaneous fat. But we also need to consider that for heavier weight individuals, a lot of that fat gets distributed inside the peritoneal cavity in what we call visceral adipose tissue or visceral fat. But ultimately, then you can develop a series not just of the size of person that we have, but we can vary based on height, based on weight, and have a whole family of individuals representing different sizes. This happens to be obese individuals, but we can go the other way too. I suppose it's for a lot of radiological procedures, this unfortunately ends up being the more interesting piece because it's what you see more of in the clinic, in practice. So ultimately, trying to translate this into radiation dose information at a practical day-by-day basis. Right? We've gone from a process where we've taken, several, maybe tens of person years to develop a phantom, to develop a computational model, and then some significant amount of time to incorporate that into a Monte Carlo process, run the Monte Carlo code for tens, hundreds, probably hundreds, or back in time, hundreds, thousands of CPU hours to get some radiation dose. So we can do all that, right? Anytime we can take we can have a phantom, make a source to match, and get some dose information. But that's not something that you're going to do on a daily basis. You can't kind of do that every time as part of the question that we were asked. So kind of today, we have a lot of these tools, and Mike gave you a quick, mentioned them before. So we have these kind of tools that we use for estimating the dose to an individual, whether they impact system, CT dose, all these kind of items, that we put together to try and get that information out. But as you kind of notice, what you see from the images, of course, they're all based on that first generation phantom. But they put together Monte Carlo calculations, kind of fit them together in a database, and try and get out for any particular scan what kind of organ dose information you might see. And then George, looking very stylish, has seen that we're still working on this idea. Basically, the same concept is not useless, but we can continue to advance the knowledge that we have, that we put into that system. So to just understand that, of course, we need, and Mike talked a little bit about this, is that we need to understand the scan parameters, and if we can combine that with pre-knowledge of the organ doses from different scan parameters, kind of split up over space, we can convolve the parameters of the scan with the organ dose information to get an estimate of the dose for a specific person for a specific scan. So just to mention again, and I won't spend any time on this, but of course that realistic patient geometry is needed, but we do need to be accurate with our representation of the CT source, and we need to, as he mentioned, validate that against measurements, and we also need to consider corrections for different machines, for tube current modulation. I'll mention that briefly as we look. And this is, I meant to kind of skip that, but it's the kind of validation we can kind of consider where we combine measured information with the simulated information to get a representation, know that we are looking at what the we have a good representation of what the source is actually producing. We need to understand that. If the source is not good, it doesn't really matter how good our patient geometry is. It doesn't tell us anything useful. So just the basic structure of the software system is to put all of this together. This is probably not all that useful as an individual piece, but this is a little bit more the layout of the system as we have it designed. And there's all the boxes that are associated with the scan parameters, with all the different kinds of options, all the different modifications of a particular scan that could be performed. Where in yellow here, this is the crux, this is the engine of what we have, which is a database of organ doses. What we've taken, and just to kind of give you some of the ideas. The idea is that we can take graphically or perhaps automatically eventually being able to integrate that scan information, all the different options that are associated with it, either through a GUI or whatever we may have, manufacturers, KDP, just some of the different kinds of options that might be present. Right? We could start with standard protocols, modify them. This is kind of the nuts and bolts of how we would get there, but the important part being how we get that organ dose database. Right? So we can turn around, we can get a complete Monte Carlo calculation performed for a single CT slice position. Right? We take one slice and one position on the body and do a full Monte Carlo calculation. We can find the dose to every organ associated with that position. Right? And that's something that's going to take some number of CPU minutes. It's probably in modern machines, we're probably looking at where they have multiple CPUs, but you're still looking at a couple hundred CPU minutes to get good information. But we can run clusters of this, we can get a lot of data. But we do this, we repeat this along the entire length of the body, and then we repeat it for each different phantom, each different model that we have. And so you can get a family of organ dose information, and we can combine each one of those single slice pieces of data according to those scan parameters. We take all that information that we just saw and extract the kind of correct set of slice informations combined, because all of the dose just becomes cumulative, and combine them into a particular the output for a particular scan. Now there's a couple of things that we need to consider in that. Mike suggested that we need to look at the variations between scanners, and we don't need to do a complete simulation. We've done it for each phantom. We don't need to do it for each scanner as well if we can apply certain corrections. One correction might be CTDI vol. One correction might be looking at the radial dose distribution, the difference between the dose at the center and the dose at the periphery, and how that correlates to the position of the organ in the body. And then we also need to consider how tube current modulation affects the dose. So different organs are sensitive to beam intensity in different directions. One of the challenges right now still being how we get that information. But just as an example, and this is, I don't expect you to kind of look at all these numbers, but this was, an attempt at trying to understand the sensitivity of organs to beam direction. And we know that some we would expect to see. This is essentially looking at the sensitivity, the relative contribution from each direction. Some don't vary that much with position, not a whole lot of variation. For these, we would expect the tube current modulation that's applied is not going to have a significant impact on dose. Whereas when we look at certain organs, we'd see that they vary very strongly with position. You could get a particular position that has, a very, one would be kind of, is the average, right? That is very different from average. These could be affected very significantly by the tube current modulation that's applied. So we need to kind of figure out how that fits into all of our dose. And then this gives us the ability, and just to kind of wrap up for a moment, is that ultimately what we want to get out is information that is somehow useful, either to tracking the information for the patient, reporting on a patient record, as is where it kind of seems to be moving towards, or tracking for an institution to understand the behavior there. And so you can just kind of briefly, we can summarize the information that goes into it. We can represent some of that information graphically. Being able to put this database together gives us some flexibility of how we do that. Generate a report, or somehow incorporate this into other useful formats. This is just kind of an example of that, being able to represent graphically the dose to different tissues, and even perhaps being able to incorporate this into a more portable format. One idea is that you could put it onto a smartphone, and we're kind of early in this development, just a trial that has very kind of fixed information. But the concept is that once you have all of this data together, it becomes relatively simple to manage it and manipulate it. Sorry, when we're looking at smartphones, we're looking at the younger generation perhaps as working on this. Undergraduate student we had that worked on trying to translate this to an Android platform. And also, and just as also to understand that not just on a per patient basis, but again on an institutional basis, to understand how scans are being performed, perhaps as a marker that's better than CT-DI-vol. We can use the doses to individual patients for tracking that. So just to kind of conclude, we need to be able to get a certain acceptance of using organ dose as a relevant and as an appropriate marker for the safety, the risk associated with CT scans, and to be able to get these results into the hands of those that actually use them. Right? The existing software, the existing tools that we have don't really meet those needs. The limitations, there's kind of several levels of limitations that I've already described, but we have these tools to kind of incorporate into another generation of systems to track that includes this, representations of individuals that are more closely resemble real patients, accurate representations of the CT source, and a way that can kind of communicate that information in a useful way, useful GUI or however we choose to capture that information. So I'm happy to take a couple of questions, anything that I can talk about here.
As you move towards a more accurate model of the patient, I wonder if you've considered also modeling the patient table, which also is a source of attenuation, and I know it's a small number, but as you get more accurate, it is something. And also, do your phantoms, very nice, by the way. Can you do arms up, arms down?
So yeah, one of the things, and I didn't show this here, but the phantoms, the boundary representation phantoms make them kind of, they're fully deformable. We have, for other applications, we've done some samples of phantoms that are sitting down, phantoms that are walking, phantoms, so we can manipulate the extremities. So we could do arms up, arms down. Frankly, we kind of take, except if we're looking at the upper chest, we cheat a little bit usually. The easiest thing is just to remove the arms. Yeah. But either way, we can do that. and include that in the possibilities. Yes.
So one last other question is the largest phantom that you displayed sort of had, from my estimation, about a BMI of about 30. But we know we have patients who have BMIs of 40 and even 50, and I wonder if you're moving in the direction of modeling the severely obese person.
We've already done work up to BMIs up to, I think, 45. But yes, so we and in fact, I think there's a paper later on about certain doses. But yeah, we can go up to very severely obese models. I guess maybe I'll switch.
Perhaps
I did not. So I didn't answer the table question, and it's one that as we're developing this data, as we're adding data into this database, we do need to consider that. We've kind of done we've started with the standard representation, but there's that's something that we'll consider as we go along.
Something of a reverse question on what John just mentioned about BMI. I noticed the models that were heavily height and weight based, mostly looking at obesity of patients. Have you heard of any models that look at different forms of increased weight, such as muscle mass, so for populations such as athletes or military? And how do you think, if any differences, would affect dose modeling?
Right. So BMI is not a perfect model of what a patient looks like. You just kind of look at that, and you point that out exactly. We know that when you have a very muscular person, the BMI does not really represent what their body fat percentage is. So this is one of those kind of one of those things is that there's some iterations I think that will evolve as we understand what are the important biological markers, what are the markers that we want to use to represent different individuals, and how we get there. So that's a good point. As you can say, some kind of represent. I don't know what the right marker is. BMI, muscle. If you can get to the point where you say, oh well, body fat measurement, a body fat percentage. So it you get more and more specific, but the process is essentially the same. If we can figure out what those markers are that we can use for individuals, we can generate a set of computational models that mimics that set of data, right? So it just becomes what we use for that measurement and how specific we need to get. And that was one of the questions I think Mike posed.
No, it wasn't. That was better.
No.
But let's do two quick questions and quick responses, and then we'll get to Asan.
Yeah. My question has to do with the dose medium. With CT vol, we're talking about dose in air. And so when we go to these other models, are you computationally taking into account the composition of the tissue?
Absolutely.
So we are talking about absorbed dose in tissue.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And not in water.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. Good question.
This will be a very naive question. Coming from a therapy background, it seems, why are we calculating doses to models? Why not just calculate a dose for the patient? It seems like a tomotherapy kind of situation where you could model the fan beam and just, you got the patient right there, and instead of doing Monte Carlo, have some sort of faster modeling where you could just calculate the dose and get isodose distributions for that particular patient at the end of the exam. Is it more difficult than it sounds?
Essentially do what therapy does.
Yeah, right. I mean,
you want to give a quick answer to that? If we don't answer,
not
we'll
really.
come back to that.
it probably takes more time than
it's an interesting thought, but
Let's come back to that
We'll
if
come
we don't
back to
answer it in the discussion. But we'll move to Asan. Thank you for that.